So, how do you know you're completely normal? Seriously, take a second and really think about that. You wake up, you go about your day, you react to the world around you, but who exactly sets the baseline for what makes your behavior standard and what makes it extraordinary? It's honestly one of the most persistent, unsolved mysteries of the human mind. How do we actually define abnormal behavior? Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating quest, defining the normal baseline. We're going to trace humanity's attempts to measure the human mind, moving from ancient superstitions all the way to the somewhat surprising limitations of modern science. Let's get right into it.
Here is our roadmap for today. First, defining the undefinable. Second, ancient and religious viewpoints. Third, statistical and clinical norms. Fourth, harmony and psychoanalysis. And finally, culture, society, and maturity.
All right, part 1, defining the undefinable, the distinction between normal and abnormal.
The very first thing we need to get straight right out of the gate is that even today, there are absolutely no definite, universal norms that perfectly clarify the distinction between normal and abnormal behavior. There's no magical ruler we can hold up to the human psyche. Because of that, thinkers have always had to rely on relative methods. These standards are simply comparative tools used to measure if a person is operating within the expected boundaries of their environment. Essentially, we've just been guessing, testing, and adjusting over the centuries. Think about how unsettling that is, right? The definition of your mental health has historically depended almost entirely on who happens to be holding the measuring stick at that exact moment in time.
Moving on to part 2, ancient and religious viewpoints. Let's look back about 600 years.
If you behaved abnormally 600 years ago, your fate was literally a coin flip. Extraordinary individuals weren't evaluated by doctors or scientists, they were judged entirely through religious lenses. On one side of the coin, an abnormal person might be worshipped. People genuinely believed they had the grace of God, or maybe possessed the spirit of a ghost, and they were served incredibly well by their communities. But on the other side of that coin, in different communities, abnormal people were heavily punished. They were looked down upon, hurt, and ridiculed, often because the community believed they were atoning for sins committed in a previous birth. It wasn't about science at all. It was entirely about spiritual interpretation.
And the wild part? These ancient criteria were deeply, dangerously personal. A person's behavior was considered normal solely if it suited the specific decision-maker of their community. If a person offended the perceived will of God or honestly just didn't fit that one local leader's arbitrary standard, they were cast out. They were deemed a sinner and left completely untreated. Imagine living in a world where your safety and standing in society depended entirely on the subjective, personal whims of a single community leader. That was the stark reality for centuries when dealing with abnormal psychology.
Okay, part 3, statistical and clinical norms. This is where we see the shift to modern scientific approaches. To finally move away from superstition, modern science introduced structured approaches to categorize behavior without all that heavy bias of religious guesswork. Humanity's grand solution was to break behavior down into these 6 modern frameworks: the statistical, the clinical, harmony, the psychoanalytic, the sociocultural, and personal maturity. Now, they are for sure far more scientific than ancient methods, but as we dive into them, you're going to see they each possess some pretty profound flaws. Let's kick things off with the statistical approach. Notice the mathematical distortion here. If we rely strictly on numbers to define what's normal, we run into a major logical fallacy. In a purely statistical graph, the vast majority of people sit right in the middle, that moderate health zone. But mathematically, that means both severe psychological abnormality and absolutely excellent peak mental health get pushed to the extreme, minority edges of the graph. Under a pure statistical model, someone in flawless mental condition might actually be classified as abnormal simply because their level of health is mathematically rare. Kind of wild, right?
Consider this really interesting example from the source about mass copying during exams in some villages in Gujarat. The statistical approach completely fails to measure social and moral levels. If we rely purely on statistics, mass cheating might seem normal simply because the majority of the room is engaging in it. But antisocial, deceptive mass behavior is clearly not psychologically healthy. This proves that statistics alone are totally blind to morality. You just can't define human health by counting heads.
Right, so what about the clinical approach? Well, this works wonderfully for physical ailments, but it struggles immensely with the mind. If you have a broken leg, a doctor can easily see you limp. The baseline for a healthy leg is physical and obvious. But the mind is invisible. If a person suffers from chronic nightmares, we might clearly observe emotional instability. But what if they routinely violate moral values while remaining perfectly calm?
There might be absolutely zero physical symptoms or clear outward signs of distress, yet that behavior can still indicate severe psychosis. Diagnosing the mind requires a completely different rulebook than diagnosing the body.
Next up, Part 4, Harmony and Psychoanalysis. This is all about examining internal structures and development.
So these next two approaches step away from outward societal judgments and actually look inward. The Harmony Standard defines health as the ordered interrelation of your bodily organs and personality acting together as a whole unit. Think of a time when you felt incredibly stressed, how that mental burden actually manifested physically, maybe as a tension headache or just profound fatigue. The Harmony framework suggests your body and mind are meant to act as one well-oiled machine. A normal person can continuously adjust to internal difficulties, but when severe mental stress or conflict disrupts that internal balance, the harmony is broken, and that is when illness occurs.
Then we've got the psychoanalytic approach, famously championed by Sigmund Freud. This standard attempts to map the subconscious phases of human development to figure out our baseline normalcy, but it falls short as a universal baseline. Why? Because the human subconscious is staggeringly complex. The source points out that Freud's phased division of psychoanalytic development is so intricate and layered that many modern psychologists actually completely reject it. It is simply too convoluted to reliably and universally apply to everyday human behavior.
All right, our final section, Part 5, Culture, Society, and Maturity. We're looking at the impact of age and environment.
The personal maturity standard basically judges normalcy by age-appropriate behavior. For example, a fully grown adult throwing a screaming tantrum on the floor for a toy is behaving abnormally for their age group. However, the source provides a really vital caveat here. While abnormal behavior can be detected by measuring intelligence along with age, having a lower intelligence or developing differently does not automatically equal mental illness. True psychiatric disorders require a lot more than just missing typical age-based milestones. Finally, we look at the socio-cultural approach, and this framework highlights perhaps the biggest hurdle of all: our environment. Practices, customs, values, and beliefs shift dramatically depending on where you are on the map. What is completely mundane in one culture might be considered deeply abnormal or even taboo in another. Normalcy is just inextricably tied to the specific social fabric a person is woven into.
So, it all boils down to this. If every society's rules are completely different, doesn't that mean literally everyone in the world is a little abnormal, depending on where they stand? The truth is, these sociocultural shifts make a single universal standard for mental health nearly impossible to pin down. From ancient religious coin flips to modern clinical charts, true normalcy remains this fascinating, highly relative mystery. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? By whose standards are you measuring your own life today?